Hey guys. Well, let's begin. Tonight we step onto a trampled patch of frozen grass, steam rising from your breath as stars blink above. You're standing at the edge of a field just before sunrise, heart pounding, knees stiff inside cold armor, fingers twitching around a sword hilt. There's dew on the ground and your opponent is already waiting. You didn't expect to be here, but honor demanded it, or pride, or a drunk accusation about someone's goat. The truth's a bit hazy now. To be honest, you probably won't survive this. So, before the lights go out, click like and subscribe, but only if you're brave enough to return tomorrow night. Also, comment where you're listening from and what time it is. I want to know who's out there in the dark with us. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, because silence makes this story worse, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink and the sky starts bleeding grey. There's a fire crackling in the distance with someone's boiling wine. Probably not for you. You're here to fight a duel, medieval style, and if you're picturing a cinematic slow magic sword ballet, you're going to be extremely disappointed. Medieval duels were dirty, chaotic, and most of the time they started with a lot of grunting and ended in someone vomiting inside their helmet. You're cold. Every metal plate strapped to your limbs weighs like a sack of bricks. Your armpits itch. You've been up since midnight, too nervous to sleep. They say sleep is for winners, but also for people not being accused of sorcery. This duel isn't personal. Well, maybe a little. You called your opponent a liar, and he called you a thief, and now here you are, dragged into a tradition older than your grandmother's recipes. And no, this isn't a tournament. There's no grandstand, no flower crowns, no princess tossing scarves. This is a judicial duel, technically legal in many parts of medieval Europe, and the outcome could mean your estate, your reputation, or your neck. And the field you're on? Not chosen by accident. This patch of ground was cleared days ago. Witnesses were summoned. 2 shields were hung on posts to signal the upcoming fight, like a medieval version of Fight Night posters. If either shield fell before the duel began, that fighter could be disqualified. Which sounds dramatic, until you realize how windy it gets out here. A monk mumbles a prayer somewhere behind you. He's probably hoping no one dies today. Good luck with that. You flex your hands. The gauntlets are stiff and slightly too tight, borrowed from your cousin who lost 3 fingers in a duel 2 summers ago. You hope it's not a family tradition. Your opponent steps forward. He's about your size, but bulkier, and you think he might be faking the limp. Some duelists feign injury to lull the other guy into overconfidence. Or it might be real. Hard to say when everyone's covered in 30 pounds of steel and awkward dignity. He raises his weapon, a long sword, broad and nicked. Nothing fancy. You, on the other hand, have chosen a poleaxe. It's not subtle, but neither are you. Now, a fun fact. Duels weren't always fought to the death. Sometimes they ended when one man couldn't fight anymore, or yielded, or lost a tooth and decided his honor wasn't worth the dental bill. But here's the twist. If you're fighting in the name of justice, like in a trial by combat, then technically, God is supposed to intervene. That's right. This fight is in theory a divine judgment. If you win, it means you're telling the truth. If you lose, well, guess you're a liar and a corpse. Historians still argue whether trial by combat was more symbolic than sincere, but plenty of people in the 1300s took it very seriously. They believed God would steer your blade if you were righteous. Which is noble, until you realize even good men sometimes trip over their own swords. The field begins to hush. A herald steps between you and your opponent, scroll in hand. He reads your names, the charges, the terms. There's something almost bureaucratic about it, like signing paperwork before a brawl. Then, silence. Then, the signal. You don't remember running forward, you just remember impact. Steel on steel, your poleaxe meeting resistance, sparks spraying near your eye. There's grunting, wheezing, and a horrible squelch of mud under boots. You slip, he lunges, someone gasps, and you're fully in it now. This isn't a duel anymore. It's survival with a side of bureaucracy. You were supposed to follow the rules. No striking a man once he's down, no stabbing through the eye slit, no kicking him while he's praying. But rules bend fast when adrenaline kicks in. That's what they don't show in movies. You trade blows. Your breath starts to fog your visor. Every hit echoes through your bones. Somewhere nearby, a dog starts barking. Maybe it smells blood. Maybe it just hates justice. One of your strikes lands on his shoulder. He stumbles. You pause, just a moment, long enough to make a decision. Finish him? Yield? Wait for divine intervention? Your opponent snarls something at you. Maybe a curse, maybe a prayer. It's hard to tell. You lift your weapon again. And the world narrows down to this cold, muddy patch of earth. You lunge again, not because you're confident, but because stopping now feels worse. The poleaxe shudders in your grip as it catches his blade mid-swing. For a heartbeat, you're locked. This duel, it didn't start here, not really. It started with words. It always starts with words. Maybe it was a land dispute. Maybe someone accused someone else of sleeping with the wrong person, or breaking a marriage oath, or stealing a pig. The point is, somewhere in a dimly lit hall or at the edge of a festival, honor got insulted and the situation escalated. Fast. Because in the medieval world, dueling wasn't just about violence. It was about saving face in a society where your name mattered more than your blood type. To back down meant humiliation. To duel meant risking death, but also potential glory, and maybe some chickens. See, by the 12th century, trial by combat was seen as a legitimate legal path in much of Europe, especially in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of France and England. Two people accuse each other, no evidence, no witnesses, fine, let God sort it out. Put them in a ring and let the outcome be divine proof. It sounds ridiculous now, but back then, it was a workaround in a justice system that relied more on oaths and ordeals than, say, actual investigation. If you swore you were innocent, and your friends swore they believed you, and you were willing to fight to prove it, that counted as proof. Of course, that meant a lot of rich guys with bad tempers got very good at fighting. And you? You're just one more pawn in the game of legal blood sport. Historians still argue whether most medieval duels were truly to the death, or just until one fighter was incapacitated. The answer depends on the year, the country, and the mood of the local magistrate. In some German codes, the winner of a duel might still get executed later if the court changed its mind. And then there's spite. Always spite. Not all duels were judicial. Some were private. Secret challenges passed in whispered Latin or dramatic declarations in front of the court. You insult my honor, I throw down my glove. Literally, a real leather glove. That's the origin of the phrase throwing down the gauntlet, by the way. If the other person picks it up, you're committed. If they refuse, public shame, and probably some guy writing a song about your cowardice. You wrench your weapon free. He ducks and swings low, aiming for your knee. You jump back, barely. Your foot slips in the mud, and you stumble sideways. Armor clanks like dropped cookware. Someone snickers. You'd punch them if you could see who. Now here's a fringe fact. Not all duels happened outdoors. Some were held in enclosed combat pits. Circular, with just enough space for two men to fight but not escape. In extreme cases, especially involving peasants or commoners, they were forced to fight naked, oiled, or even half-submerged in barrels to even the odds. You want humiliating? Try defending your innocence while barefoot in a tub, swinging a club, with everyone in town watching. Others were highly ritualized. A formal code of conduct existed for some duels. You had to submit a formal challenge, secure neutral witnesses, agree on weapons, swear sacred oaths. And yet every now and then, someone just got stabbed in an alley. You twist your body, catching his sword against your vambrace, and shove forward. He stumbles. You advance, breath rasping, vision flickering. The herald calls out a warning. He's watching for foul play. Maybe he saw that last kick. You didn't mean to. Maybe you did. The crowd murmurs. Most of them aren't here for justice. They're here for entertainment. To see blood on the snow. To see someone fall. It's funny, isn't it? This whole tradition grew out of a belief in divine fairness, but most people just treat it like a spectator sport. A squire offers a shout, something about your stance. You ignore him. Your arms are heavy. Your legs feel like wet clay. You think you might puke. Is that normal? Absolutely. Fighters often vomited, urinated, even passed out from adrenaline before or during a duel. No shame. That's the body trying to survive something insane. There's a long moment of no strikes, just circling. You both breathe hard. Your opponent's sword drips rainwater, or maybe sweat. You can't tell. You think back to the moments that led you here. The accusation, the gathering of witnesses, the way they led you into a candlelit hall and asked you if you'd accept trial by combat. The way you didn't hesitate. You should have hesitated. But now here you are, one wrong move from dying, or winning, or both. Someone rings a bell, a pause, time for water, or mercy. You're not sure, but neither of you step back. There's no referee, only fate. You whisper under your breath, something soft, half prayer, half threat. He does the same. You circle again, boots squelching. This isn't a duel anymore, it's a reckoning. You circle the patch of earth again, half wading through mud, half dragging your boots like they're nailed to the underworld. Every breath sounds like a dying bellows inside your helmet. You don't know how long you've been fighting. 5 minutes? 30. Time warps when pain is involved. The crowd's grown quiet, like they're waiting for something decisive. But you and your opponent are locked in this exhausted, sweaty ballet, neither of you willing to collapse first. This brings us to something most people forget. Location mattered. A duel didn't happen just anywhere. There were rules, often very specific ones, about where and how the duel could occur. Whether it was a judicial trial or a matter of personal honour, the field of battle had to meet certain conditions. You're standing in a Federplatz, a field of feud. It's been inspected, prepared and blessed, or at least cleared of large rocks and cow dung. Neutral ground, somewhere both sides could agree on. The fight couldn't start until the site was declared ready. And it wasn't always some grassy plain. Sometimes duels took place in courtyards, in dry riverbeds, in specially dug fighting pits lined with logs, or, in one hilariously inconvenient case, on a small island where the tide came in too fast, cutting the match short. In some German customs, a square or circular ring was drawn and roped off, often 30 feet wide. Too big, and one fighter could just run around. Too small, and you'd be face-hugging from the start. Your battlefield tonight? A rectangle lined with standing stones and half-frozen ditches. The audience is standing behind a short fence, meant to keep onlookers from intervening, though if things get heated, that fence isn't stopping anyone. There's a designated neutral zone near the edges. Historians still argue whether these neutral zones were actually enforced, or mostly symbolic. Some suggest that once a duel turned ugly, the referees conveniently looked the other way. You take a cautious step to the left. The ground dips slightly. Someone forgot to level this part. That could cost you your footing, and your jaw. The common tactic? Choosing uneven ground on purpose to favour one duelist. Say your opponent has bad knees, or prefers tight swings. A sloped or cluttered field could slow them down, or cramp their footwork. Not illegal, just shady. And you? You fought here before. Not a duel, just practice. You remember the way the wind cuts from the east, and how the far corner collects water when it rains. It's why you positioned yourself facing uphill. You want gravity on your side. Your opponent doesn't look like he notices. His stance is slightly too forward, weight on his toes like a sprinter. Rookie move. Maybe he's not as experienced as he looks, or maybe he's baiting you. Duelists were allowed, sometimes even expected, to visit the fighting field ahead of time. like walking a crime scene before the crime happens. They'd measure distances, inspect the soil, check for hidden hazards, anything that gave them a split-second advantage later. This kind of battlefield prep wasn't just tactical, it was ceremonial. Part of the duel's weight came from its setting, a sacred place, a legal space, where truth and justice were allegedly settled through violence. Quirky fact: in some traditions, especially in German towns like Augsburg or Nuremberg, the field was sprinkled with blessed sand or straw. The idea was that the combat would leave a pure imprint, untouched by foul ground. Did it help? Probably not, but it made everyone feel better about what was basically an orchestrated beating. You reposition your grip. The poleaxe is getting slippery. Your gloves are damp inside. The leather's starting to rot at the seams. Cheap stuff. You make a mental note to punch your squire later. Not hard, just enough. Then the wind picks up, and with it a low hum from the watchers. Your opponent's starting to pant louder, shoulders rising and falling. You've both been conserving energy, but the crowd smells blood. They want the next phase. You close the distance. One strike. Another. He parries high. You swing low. Your weapon scrapes his leg armor, and you feel a slight vibration travel up your arms. Not a hit, but close. A century ago, this duel might have taken place inside a monastery's outer wall, or behind the town hall, with judges watching from a wooden platform. Now, it's on common ground, but the same ritual applies. You spit into the dirt. That's not dramatic flair. You just need to breathe. Somewhere behind you, a priest clears his throat. He's probably muttering about sin and mercy. Fun fringe tidbit. Some duels were fought over relics, not for justice, but for religious dominance. Knights argued over whose relic was holier, then fought to prove it. Because nothing says divine supremacy like smashing your opponent with a steel club while shouting Latin verses. You don't have Latin on your side. You barely have your balance. But you have the field, and that matters. A gust of wind blows your opponent's hood sideways. He adjusts it, revealing a bloodied cheek. That's new. He's slowing. You're not sure if it's fatigue or frustration, but he's leaving more openings. The field might be neutral, but you're not. You feint to the left. He bites. His blade flashes wide, and you strike the open flank. A solid clang, and he reels back. That's the thing about this kind of combat. You don't need to kill. You just need to break. Break his stance. Break his nerve. Break his will. You plant your feet, grip tighter, and think of the terrain beneath you. Not just mud and grass, but history. All the duelists who came before, who stood where you're standing, on sacred dirt, under a sky that didn't care who won. You breathe deep. The field is yours. You blink sweat out of your eyes. Not that it helps much. Your helmet's visor is narrow, the light is dim, and your opponent keeps circling like a wolf that skipped breakfast. Your hands ache, not from a wound, just from gripping the weapon too long. The weight, the strain, the fear, it all adds up like bad debt. And now you face one of the most pivotal questions a medieval duelist had to ask. What weapon do you trust to save your life? You look down at your poleaxe, chipped, stained, reliable. It's been your choice since the start, and it hasn't failed you yet. But he's got a longsword, and he's wielding it with a familiarity that suggests he was born holding it. In medieval duels, weapon choice was everything. It was also often part of the challenge terms, sometimes agreed upon by both parties, sometimes dictated by custom or local laws, and sometimes completely unfair. Think you'd show up with a sword and find your opponent swinging a spiked mace the size of a melon? It happened. Certain courts allowed mismatched weapons, especially in trial by combat. If one fighter was seen as weaker, imagine a nobleman in full plate going up against a peasant. The court might make the noble fight one-handed, or barefoot, or with a shorter blade. Fairness had a strange flavour back then. Historians still argue whether these handicaps were symbolic or genuinely balance the scales. Some say they were just there to humiliate low-rank fighters further. Others insist it was a way to simulate equal footing. Both theories feel true, depending on the case. You sidestep a thrust. It misses by a breath. You counter with an overhead swing that your arms barely complete. The poleaxe slams against his shoulder plate. He stumbles, but doesn't fall. Let's talk inventory. Swords were common, but not the movie kind. No backflipping, no pirouette-style duels. Long swords, arming swords, falchions, each had distinct purposes. Long swords were great for reach and power. Arming swords were one-handed and often paired with shields. Falchions looked like machetes and hit like iron hammers. Axes were brutal and unrefined, but popular among those who liked results over elegance. They could hook limbs, cleave helmets, and scare the crowd half to death. Poleaxes, your current friend, were the Swiss Army knives of melee combat. They had an axe blade, a hammerhead, and a nasty little spike. Perfect for duels in armor. And when I say perfect, I mean terrifying. Daggers were last resorts. But sometimes the entire duel was dagger unleashed, especially judicial duels between peasants. They'd be thrown into a ring with nothing but knives and hope. Real cozy. Maces and clubs. Yeah. Nothing says subtle disagreement like a steel ball on a stick. Some were flanged to dent armor more effectively. Others were just heavy and mean. Fringe fact. In one 14th century duel, a man fought with a wooden baton because he was a monk and couldn't draw blood. His opponent? A mercenary with a sword. Shockingly, the monk won. Divine intervention, or just really good aim? You dodge again, barely. Your weapon's too long for tight quarters. If you're not careful, he'll close the gap and your poleaxe will be a liability. That's why some duelists carried multiple weapons. Start with a long weapon, switch to a short one when the distance collapses. It was legal in many dueling codes, provided both sides agreed. You've got a dagger on your hip, just in case. Of course, all this assumes you were allowed to choose at all. In some judicial combats, the court selected weapons for the duelists, sometimes even made them both use the same item, like a club, or a wooden cudgel, or a length of rope. Yes, rope duels existed. Fighters would each hold the same rope in one hand, tied together like unwilling dance partners, and try to stab or club each other with the free hand. The idea? Prevent retreat, create intimacy, force a conclusion. You grip your poleaxe tighter. He's circling in closer now, maybe sensing your fatigue, or maybe planning to draw his dagger. You think back to a famous duel you heard about, Jean de Carouge versus Jacques Legris in 1386. They fought over an accusation of assault in a judicial duel blessed by the French king. They wore full plate, wielded lances, swords, and daggers. The fight was brutal. Carouge won by stabbing Legris in the throat after both were too tired to stand. The duel became legend, not just for the violence, but because it settled a legal matter in front of the royal court. The people saw justice served, or at least saw a guy bleed out in the name of honor. You shift your stance, mentally preparing your next move. He lunges, but not fast enough. You deflect with the axe head and step in, trying to hook his leg. It works, sort of. He stumbles, but his sword lashes out blindly, scraping your side. Pain flashes. Not deep, but enough to knock the wind out of your lungs. You grit your teeth. The crowd roars. They're not cheering for justice. They're cheering for weapons, for contact, for something to write ballads about later, wildly inaccurate ones sung off-key at inns. And you're just trying to survive. You backpedal, gasping, trying to re-establish range. The poleaxe is better at distance, where you can swing, maneuver, control the fight. This isn't about rage anymore. It's about mechanics, timing, leverage, knowing where his joints bend and when to strike. You can't rely on brute strength. That's how you end up flat on your back with a blade in your visor. No, you have to think like your weapon. Because that's the hidden truth. In a medieval duel, You don't just fight with a weapon, you become it. Your arms feel like wet rope. Every swing of the poleaxe is slower now, more guess than precision. Still, you hold it like a lifeline, because without it, you're just a walking bruise waiting to fall. And here's where fashion meets function. Your armor, the only thing between you and an early grave. You didn't just pick it for the shine. You picked it because every plate, buckle, and rivet could decide how long you last out here. But let's back up a bit. Dressing for a medieval duel wasn't as simple as grab your armor and go. Depending on the type of duel, local laws, your social class, and how much coin you had, your outfit might range from full head-to-toe plate armor to, well, something much less impressive. You're lucky. You've got a decent set. The breastplate is slightly dented, the gauntlets borrowed, but the greaves are new. Shiny. Heavy. Impressively scuffed already. Your opponent wears a mix, some plate, some chainmail, some leather. That tells you two things. One, he's probably not a noble, and two, he might move faster than you in close quarters. Something to keep in mind. Now, what were the armor options? First, mail armor. Those interlocking rings. It's flexible, decent against cuts, terrible against blunt force. A mace will turn your ribs to soup under mail, even if the skin doesn't break. Mail was common for centuries, but once the poleaxe and crossbow became popular, it fell out of fashion, painfully. Then came plate armor, crafted steel slabs that wrapped the body like a portable fortress. Contrary to Hollywood, plate didn't make you move like a tin robot. A well-made suit let you run, jump, even do somersaults. Not that you do one in a duel. You'd get stabbed halfway through. Some duelists wore brigandine's cloth or leather jackets with small metal plates sewn inside. Think medieval Kevlar. More flexible than plate, more protective than mail, and easier to afford if you weren't rolling in gold. In lower class or peasant duels, especially judicial ones, armor wasn't always allowed. That's when things got truly strange. Ever hear of a man fighting in his underwear, or completely naked except for a shield? It happened, particularly in judicial duels designed to prove divine judgment, where too much armor was considered cheating against God. Historians still argue whether those accounts are literal or metaphorical. Were duelists truly forced to fight in the buff, or was it exaggerated to make the loser seem even more pitiful in death? Either way, it's the stuff of nightmares. A favourite oddball case? A German legal code described a duel between a man and a woman, where the man stood in a pit up to his waist, armed with a club, while the woman circled above with a stone in a sock. Balanced, apparently. You shift your weight, thankful your duel isn't that one. Though judging by the way your opponent's breathing, fast, shallow, this one's not going to last much longer. Your helmet presses into your brow. Sweat trickles past your eyebrows, stinging your eyes. You want to take it off. You won't. You can't. A visor left open is an invitation to become a cautionary tale. Still, there's a trade-off. Visibility versus protection. Some knights tilted their helmets just slightly to gain a few degrees of sight. Others preferred open-faced helms, great for breathing, horrible when someone swings a flanged mace at your nose. You recall stories of duelists customizing their armor in bizarre ways. One French knight had a breastplate engraved with a prayer so ornate it acted like a mirror and blinded his opponent at sunrise. Another had chainmail woven into his beard, for style or protection, no one's quite sure. There's also the armor of desperation, farmers tying pans to their legs, layering animal hides under their tunics, or stuffing their shirts with straw. If it slowed down a blade by even a second, it was worth it. You're feeling the heat now, your neck's chafing from the gorget, that metal collar guarding your throat. But it's better than having your windpipe crushed like a goose egg. Duelists who forgot their gorgets, they didn't get many second chances. Weight is becoming your enemy. Your legs drag, your shoulders hunch. You fantasize about throwing off your cuirass, just for a second, just to breathe. But your brain whispers the reminder, that's how people die. Back to business. Armor wasn't just about protection, it was psychological warfare. You walk onto the field gleaming like a hero from a bard's tale, and suddenly your opponent rethinks that trash talk from earlier. A full suit could weigh between 40 to 60 pounds, not light, but distributed evenly enough to be manageable for trained fighters. A final quirky fact: some armors designed trap plates sections that looked weak but were actually reinforced, tricking opponents into targeting useless spots. Think of it as medieval trolling, but lethal. Your opponent staggers slightly. His shoulder plate hangs at an odd angle, the strap cut loose. That's your in. You press forward. A quick feint, a low sweep. Your axe catches the strap, yanks it fully off. The armor clatters to the ground. He's exposed now, on one side. And just like that, the fight changes. Armor levels the field, but when it fails, or vanishes, you're back to flesh and panic. Your pulse pounds. You feel the weight of every buckle and plate, every choice you made when you dressed this morning. You didn't know you'd be grateful for a groin protector, but here you are. You raise your poleaxe for the next strike. The armor groans. The crowd holds its breath. And under all the steel and sweat, so do you. You shift your stance, trying to quiet the tremble in your knees. One shoulder of your opponent's armor is gone, but don't celebrate yet. A cornered fighter can be more dangerous than a confident one, especially when there's a crowd. And oh yes, the crowd is watching. They press against the fence line like wolves at a cookout, some wide-eyed, some yawning, some shouting encouragement that sounds more like threats. One woman waves a strip of cloth that might be a favour or just a dish rag. A kid eats something that's definitely not meat. A man yells in Flemish. You don't speak Flemish, but it sounds insulting. Medieval duels were rarely private. Even the most serious combat, like a judicial duel to decide guilt, came with a built-in audience. The community gathered, not just to witness justice, but to be entertained. Justice, after all, is more satisfying when someone bleeds for it. And there's a system to all this. You're not just two brutes bashing each other until one falls. You've got witnesses, seconds, heralds, and sometimes a priest, all managing the ritual. Let's break that down, because you are absolutely not alone in this ring. Over by the edge of the field stands your second, your chosen support, part hype man, part lawyer, part emergency response. If you fall, he runs to you. If someone accuses you of cheating, he argues your case. Sometimes they're family, sometimes just someone loud and persuasive. Then there was the herald, the man in the fancy tunic reading the charges before the fight began. He's still there, watching closely. His job, to enforce the rules, track the fight, and intervene if things spiral. Think of him as a referee, only with better handwriting and more political sway. Some duels, especially those tied to noble courts, had appointed judges. Actual nobles seated at the edge of the field, sipping wine, nodding solemnly while watching people beat the snot out of each other. Imagine trial by combat, with a VIP section. Behind the crowd, a priest mutters prayers. He blessed the duel before it started, asking for God's will to be done. He's also here in case someone dies, which, let's be honest, is a solid bet at this point. And then there's the audience. Friends, enemies, total strangers. Everyone wants to see how it ends. Some take bets. Some compose poems mid-fight. Some sketch crude little drawings of your nose getting broken. This isn't just a fight. It's theatre. And like any good show, there's choreography, lighting, sunrise preferably, and occasionally heckling. Historians still argue whether the crowd actually affected the fight itself. In formal duels, sure. The rules tried to keep spectators neutral. But there are plenty of stories about coin being slipped, bribes being whispered, and seconds sneaking weapons to their side mid-battle. Did anyone look the other way? Often. You notice your second gesture, maybe a signal, maybe just a mosquito. You squint through your visor and catch a nod from him, encouraging, or worried, or both. Here's a quirky bit of trivia. Duel crowds sometimes brought food. It could last for hours, so naturally folks brought pies, cheese, even wine. If that sounds strange, remember, we're still centuries away from Netflix. Watching two people almost die was prime entertainment. You refocus. Your opponent's limping now. His weight shifted. His shield hand is dragging. You almost feel bad. Almost. Another lunge. You parry. This time the hit lands with a crack, wood against helmet. He stumbles back, dazed. Gasps ripple through the crowd. They love that. Seconds step forward, ready to rush in if someone drops. The herald leans in, prepared to call it if necessary. But not yet. You both still stand. Let's not forget the ceremonial parts of this spectacle. Before the fight, you stood facing your opponent. You swore an oath, by God, by saints, by your own family line, that you were in the right, that you weren't lying, that you would abide by the outcome, even if it killed you. That oath made it real. To break it? That was perjury of the soul, a lie so deep that even confession couldn't fix it. If you lost the duel, and somehow lived but had broken that oath, you could still be executed, or excommunicated, or exiled, and the crowd would cheer for that too. Because to them, this wasn't just a fight, it was moral theatre, and in moral theatre, everyone wants a satisfying ending. Some duels got too dramatic. One man faked fainting, then stabbed his opponent while being carried away. Another tried to bribe his second into poisoning the enemy's water. Didn't end well for either. You've made it this far without cheating. Mostly. A younger man at the fence screams your name. He's either your cousin or your biggest fan. You wave. Barely. Just enough to remind yourself you're still alive. This is the part of the duel where both fighters stop thinking and start surviving. Your second shouts something now. Watch the right. Or, he's bleeding. Or, finish it. You can't tell over the ringing in your ears. Still, it helps. You remember you're not alone. Not really. You've got backup. Witnesses. People who'll carry you off this field whether you win or lose. Your opponent takes one last step toward you and swings. You duck. Barely. Your poleaxe rises. Time slows. And the crowd stops breathing. Your poleaxe connects with a sickening clang, the kind of sound that makes ribs question their loyalty to the rest of the body. Your opponent staggers, arms flailing, weapon falling from his grip. The crowd lets out a collective gasp, part awe, part anticipation, part did we just see that? But you don't move in for the kill. Not yet. Because this isn't a bar brawl, this is a ritual, and you both swore an oath before it began. An oath that carried the weight of law, faith, and honour. 3 things that don't mix well with impulsive murder. It started hours ago, back when the dew was still fresh on the grass and your armour was merely uncomfortable, not suffocating. You stood across from your opponent, both of you silent, facing a priest and a herald, while a clerk read aloud the cause of the conflict. You remember it now, his accusation, your denial, the court's decision that words wouldn't suffice. Trial by combat. You both agreed. And more than that, you both swore the dual oath. Every culture had its own version, but most shared common bones. You promised you were in the right. You promised to fight with honour. You promised that God would be the final judge. This was sacred stuff. In some cases, the oath was sworn on a relic, maybe a saint's bone, maybe a splinter from a holy cross, maybe just the nearest Bible that hadn't been used as a coaster. Break the oath, and you didn't just risk your life, you risked your soul. The herald had you each recite your parts, loudly, clearly, no mumbling. Witnesses watched, scribes recorded. You held your hand to your chest, or in some cases placed it on the weapon itself. That part varies, depending on region and century. In France, the oath might include language like, I say and affirm upon my body and my soul that the accusation made is false, and I shall prove it by combat, which sounds noble, until your opponent swings an axe at your kneecap. Historians still argue whether the oath was truly about divine justice, or just a way to make sure everyone took it seriously. Some believe the ritual was a psychological tool, bind the fighters with a shared understanding, force them to accept the consequences, remove any doubt. You've accepted those consequences now. Your opponent, groaning, stumbles back to his knees. His sword lies just out of reach. He glares up at you, lips parted. Maybe to yield, maybe to curse, maybe to pray. There's a pause. You hear birds chirping. And then he lunges for the sword. You respond on instinct. A quick step forward, your poleaxe dropping hard across his wrist. Crack. The sword remains on the ground. He howls and falls onto his back, clutching his hand. The herald strides forward. The seconds lean in, and somewhere behind you, the priest starts reading last rites, just in case. But the herald doesn't end it yet. He looks to you, because there's one final step, and the question of mercy. The duel oath promised you'd fight to the rightful outcome, but didn't always require death. If your opponent yielded, confessed, or was clearly unable to continue, the fight could end without a fatal blow. But the choice, it was yours. You think about that. You stand over him, his breath ragged, his eyes unfocused. The crowd begins to murmur again, growing louder. Some cry for blood, others call for mercy. You hear your name in the chaos. The herald raises his hand to quiet them. And then he asks the sacred words. Do you require further judgment? In other words, do you want to finish him off? It's not as easy a decision as it sounds. If you kill a man who yielded, some might see that as justice. Others might call it murder. Depends on the town, the year, the politics, the religion, and how many friends your opponent has. Quirky side note. In some Germanic laws, the victor of a judicial duel could legally execute the loser, but only after waiting for a sign from God, like a change in the wind, or a bird flying overhead, or some very creative lightning. If no sign appeared, you had to settle for humiliation. You lower your weapon just a fraction. Your opponent exhales, relief or fear, you can't tell. And you say, no further judgment. The herald nods. The crowd reacts like a popped wine barrel, half cheering, half groaning. Someone throws a cap in the air. Another person throws a boot. Typical. Your second rushes into the field, slapping your back, praising your restraint, or your strategy, or your ability to not throw up inside your helmet. Take your pick. The priest walks to your opponent and begins tending to him. He'll live. With a broken wrist, bruised pride, and possibly a lifelong grudge. But he'll live. You stagger back toward your side of the field, armor clinking, lungs aching. You feel heavier now, even with the weight of the duel lifted. Because victory isn't always light. There's one last part to this ritual, cleansing. Some dueling traditions required the victor to pray, to wash, to fast, to purge themselves of the violence they'd just performed. Not because it was wrong, necessarily, but because it was unclean. You've just laid hands on another soul, and even if God judged in your favor, the stain of blood doesn't come off easily. Not from your hands, not from your mind. You hear someone say your name again, this time softer, respectful. You turn your face to the sun. It's climbed above the trees now, golden and warm. A new day. And for now, at least, you're still standing in it. You sit down hard on a stool that wasn't there a second ago. Your second must have dragged it out the moment the duel ended. Your legs no longer feel like they belong to you. They're twitching, shaky, buzzing with leftover adrenaline. Your gauntlets come off with a wet slap. Your hands are white, raw, and starting to cramp. Across the field, your opponent is being helped to his feet. He's pale, grimacing, covered in mud, blood, and bruises. You don't wave. He doesn't either. The truce is official, but let's not pretend anyone's feeling friendly just yet. You sip warm water. It tastes like iron and regret. You're not sure if it's from your mouth or the cup. But as the tension melts away from your shoulders, you replay one moment over and over again, that first charge. The instant when the signal was given, the world snapped into a tunnel, and you launched forward, no turning back. Every duel begins with it, and it's never pretty. That's the myth, right? The noble clash. The two men drawing swords and saluting before a clean, choreographed fight. Yeah, not exactly. The opening moments of a real medieval duel were sudden, loud, and frantic. Forget the movies. There was no slow circling, no banter, no drawn-out testing of defences, just a violent sprint to establish dominance. You think back to yours, the cold air in your lungs, the metallic taste of fear, the way your boots struggled to grip the soft ground. You ran forward like your life depended on it, because it did. First strikes mattered. They didn't always end the fight, but they could tilt it. A lucky hit could break a finger, crack a knee, rattle a brain inside a helmet hard enough to make someone forget what year it was. Historians still argue whether duelists were trained to go all in from the first step, or whether early strikes were meant to feel out the opponent. The truth seems to be both. If you had skill, you tried to measure your enemy. If you didn't, you just charged and prayed. Some manuals, like the fecht books of the German masters, described specific openings, guards, grips, counters. But that assumed you were calm enough to remember your training. Most people, in the real moment, forgot half of it and just swung. In your case, your poleaxe was raised high. You aimed for his helm, and he met you mid-sprint. Your weapons clashed in a thunderous arc that nearly spun you both off balance. That opening exchange, pure chaos. Sometimes the first blow ended things outright. One recorded duel in the 15th century ended after a single strike to the jaw. Another, more infamous case began with one man charging and promptly tripping over his own feet. He was pinned in seconds. And if you're wondering whether cheap shots happened in those first moments, absolutely. The initial rush was where a fighter might pretend to trip, then stab low, or strike while the opponent was still lowering their visor. And once that first blow landed, all bets were off. A quirky account from 1379 describes a duel between two Frenchmen where one opened with a war cry, then spat in the other's eye before swinging. Technically legal, definitely frowned upon. The opening charge was also where fighters revealed their personality. Were you aggressive or cautious, calculating or reckless? Some knights were known for faking wild charges, then switching gears mid-step. Others just barreled forward and relied on momentum and screaming. You recall the sound your opponent made, half a yell, half a grunt. It was the sound of someone trying to psych himself up, while also not choking on his own spit. You might have done the same. You remember the first clash, how both weapons locked, how his breath came through his visor in bursts, how you could smell the oil on his leather, how you shoved, twisted, and nearly headbutted him without meaning to. That's something no one talks about. Duelists collided. It wasn't all strikes and parries. It was slams, grapples, shoulder checks, sometimes even tackling. Especially once weapons got tangled. At that point, it turned into a wrestling match in armor. Glorious, sweaty, awkward wrestling. One of the oldest dueling treatises explicitly includes knee strikes, elbow blows, and even biting, though biting was considered inelegant. Still happened, though. That first charge was when all your theories about the fight got shredded by reality. Whatever you planned to do, gone. What you did do, react, breathe, swing. And sometimes scream. Because screaming was a tactic too. It wasn't just fear, it was disorientation. A sudden, guttural shout right before striking could throw your opponent off, disrupt their rhythm. Intimidation played a big role. Some fighters painted their armor or helmets to look like demons, beasts, or skeletal faces, anything to unnerve their enemy in those crucial first seconds. One German knight famously carved teeth into the front of his helmet and wore a cape made of dyed goatskin. Did it help? No. He lost in 2 minutes, but he looked terrifying. You lean back now, letting your muscles cool, the fire of battle slowly dying out inside your chest. The seconds clear the field, the herald is packing up, the crowd's starting to wander off, buzzing with excitement or disappointment, depending on whose side they backed. A few linger, some shake your hand, others pretend not to look impressed. You feel their eyes, though. They all remember how it began, because the charge isn't just the start of a fight. It's a confession of rage, of fear, of hope. It's the most honest second in any duel, the moment you choose to close the distance, risking everything for the truth, or your version of it. You glance at your opponent one last time. He's seated now, bandaged, eyes downcast. You wonder what his charge looked like from his side. You wonder if he knew he'd already lost it the moment he stepped forward. You'll never know. But you do know this. Next time, if there is a next time, you'll charge first. And you won't stop. Your feet are numb, not from cold, from stomping, pivoting, lunging through nearly an hour of mud, steel, and adrenaline. You'd think the worst of the duel is over now that you've walked away, but it's not. The worst was never the clean strikes or the graceful dodges. It's what came next, the mess, the part where things get ugly, the part nobody sings about. You remember it clearly. His elbow in your ribs, your gauntlet clawing at his visor, mud splashing into your eyes. Somewhere between the third and fifth exchange, the fight turned feral. No more form, no more training, just pure desperation. This is when things like honor and technique stop mattering, because now it's personal. You're hurting. He's bleeding. Your instincts override your fencing masters, and you realize this is what most duels actually looked like. Forget the elegant footwork. Dueling at this stage was a grind. A rolling, stumbling mess of grunts, clanks, and sneaky elbow-to-the-throat tricks. This was the middle game, and it was always nastier than anyone wanted to admit. You recall how he went for your leg, not with his sword, but with his hand, just reached out and grabbed it mid-swing. You toppled sideways like a tipped cart, poleaxe yanked from your grip. The only thing that saved you was that accidental roll onto your back, armor clattering. You kicked. Not a knightly kick, a blind, panic group-to-the-face kind of kick. And you were back in it. A lot of duels entered this chaotic phase, where weapons got dropped, technique collapsed, and people just started grabbing and shoving. There's a word for it, Harnischfechten. Armoured fighting, grappling while wearing what feels like a small anvil. Historians still argue whether this middle stage was trained for or just endured. Some manuals taught it how to hook joints, twist fingers, crush windpipes even through mail, but surviving it, that was something else. One famous German fight master, Hans Talhofer, included moves in his manuals like half-sorting, where you grip your blade halfway up with both hands to use it like a dagger. Practical, dangerous, ugly, and effective. You tried that at one point, remember? Your poleaxe too long for close quarters, you gripped the shaft halfway, driving the hammer end into his pauldron, trying to crush the socket. It worked, kinda. It also jarred your wrist so hard you thought the bones cracked. There were other moments too, blurry flashes. He shoved his gauntlet into your face, fingers scraping under your helm. You headbutted him. An instinct, not a plan. He responded by kneeing you square in the thigh, which doesn't sound bad until you realize that's where your mail was weakest. You heard something pop. Could have been his armor. Could have been your own muscles screaming for a break. And then there was the dirt. Not symbolic, literal. The ground became another weapon. The deeper the fight dragged on, the more each of you tried to use it. Mud smeared into visors, boots stamping into hands, faces shoved into puddles. You recall being on top for a moment, fists raining down in a rhythm that was more survival than strategy. Then you were underneath again, back in the grinder. And here's a fringe detail you won't read in court records. Spitting happened. Spit in the eye, in the mouth, anything to disrupt, distract, disgust. One chronicler in the 14th century described a duel where a knight shoved dirt into his opponent's mouth to mute his prayers. It worked. The other man choked, lost focus, lost the fight. You almost understand that now. And while we're here, let's talk about blood. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't spurting like a stage play. It was sticky. It was slow. It got in places blood shouldn't go. It mixed with sweat and rain and the smell of leather oil until your senses didn't know what to process first. You remember the moment you tasted it. Not yours. His. A slash across his brow had trickled through his helmet and somehow reached your glove. When you adjusted your visor later, it touched your lips. That metallic tang is still there. At one point, you're pretty sure he bit you. Through the glove, maybe. Or when you shoved your hand into his helmet slit. Teeth clamped down, fast and furious. You yanked your hand out before he broke skin, but it left a mark. Historians debate whether biting was ever formalized in dueling codes. Most say no. But enough reports mention it, along with eye gouging, groin strikes, even fingernail rakes, that it clearly happened. Probably often. The duel by now had descended. You weren't two men arguing about honor anymore. You were animals. Which is exactly why people gathered to watch. Not for glory, for the reveal. To see how far a man would go when stripped of strategy, when pushed into the filth and pain. Would he cheat? Cry? Claw? Give up? You didn't. And neither did he. Which is why it kept going. Strike, grab, shove, stagger. Until someone finally messed up a stumble, a misplaced foot, a hand left unguarded. For you, it was when he slipped in the mud after that failed sweep. His sword jammed into the ground like a lightning rod, and you took the shot that disarmed him. But before that, it was 30 brutal seconds of pure mess. Every move improvised, every breath painful, every thought reduced to one question. How do I not die right now? You know what's weird? You miss it a little. Not the pain, not the fear, but the clarity. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not your title, your debts, your uncle's estate, or the girl who stopped writing you last winter. Just you, him, and the mud. And now? Now as you peel off your soaked tunic and inspect the bruises blooming across your ribs, you realize you'll carry that mess with you forever. Because the middle of the duel is where men stop fighting each other and start fighting themselves. You're lying flat now, armor half peeled off, tunic plastered to your skin, back against cold grass. You haven't moved for 10 minutes, maybe more. Breathing hurts, thinking hurts. You blink at the sky and wonder if it always spun this much. You're not dead, which is nice, but you're definitely not okay. Because you've just survived the long grind of pain, the part of the duel that doesn't make it into ballads, the part that's less about action and more about endurance. This is the part where time slows, muscles scream, and victory feels like a cruel joke. You remember it clearly. When the initial adrenaline wore off, your limbs began to lag. Every swing felt heavier, every breath took effort. Your vision blurred around the edges. You stopped trying to win. You started trying to not fall. This is what breaks most duelists. Not the first strike, not even the blood. It's the drag, the grind, the inescapable weight of pain compounding second by second. Your fingers locked at one point, literally refused to open. You remember looking down and thinking, that's not good, but your brain had no solutions. You'd gripped the poleaxe so hard for so long that your hand forgot how to let go. And your legs? They betrayed you. Mid-lunge, your left knee just gave out. No drama, no injury, just refused to participate. That stumble nearly got your head caved in. And yet, you kept moving. Historians still argue about the typical duration of medieval duels. Some say they were over in minutes. Others insist they stretch to an hour or more. But most agree anything longer than 10 minutes in full armor is absolute torment. It's not just the weight, it's the cumulative damage. You'd taken 3 hits to the ribs, none deep enough to pierce the breastplate, but deep enough to shake your organs. You felt your stomach bounce. You tasted bile. Your arms, constantly lifted and rotating, felt like firebrands. Try holding a 5-pound dumbbell above your head for 5 straight minutes. Now imagine doing that while dodging a guy trying to axe you. Your neck cramped, your back knotted, your jaw clenched so tight it ached more than your bruises. You remember biting the inside of your mouth just to stay focused. That taste of blood, not from him, from you. And then came the ringing. That constant tone that starts after a blow to the helmet. You were struck twice, once on the side, once on top. The first time it rattled your brain. The second time it rattled your soul. You think you forgot your own name for a minute. By the time you both slowed to a crawl, weapon drags, slumped shoulders, sluggish feints, you realized the duel had entered phase 3. No longer a contest of skill, now a contest of suffering. You didn't swing to kill anymore. You swung to delay, to discourage, to make him stop before you did. He did the same. You both looked ridiculous. There's no polite way to say it. 2 tin cans clanking around, slipping, grunting, occasionally missing each other entirely. At one point you both swung and missed each other by a full 2 feet. A sheep could have wandered between you and lived. Someone in the crowd laughed. You hated them. But it wasn't funny. You were locked in the purest form of human struggle. Who can take more? Some chroniclers from the 14th and 15th centuries describe this exact stage. One called it the grey moment, where vision fades and body heat turns to steam. He wrote of men so exhausted they collapsed mid-duel and had to be dragged upright just to finish. Not because they were losing, but because fatigue knocked them out before the blade did. That almost happened to you? Fringe facts: a handful of duels ended with both fighters collapsing and neither one winning. The courts had to step in and declare a verdict based on crowd impressions. Imagine crawling through hell only to have a bunch of drunk nobles decide who looked more tired. You remember the oddest moment? The silence. At some point, everything got quiet. Not just around you, inside you. That primal noise of survival, the heartbeat, the breath, the anxious chatter, just stopped. It was like your body reached a pain threshold and decided to turn the volume down. You felt empty, calm, like drowning but warm. That's the moment most people give in. You didn't. Because somewhere under the bruises past the cracked lip, beyond the torn ligament in your shoulder, you'll definitely feel tomorrow something kept whispering, "Stay up." Not for glory, not for God, just because. And that's the strange thing. Medieval duels weren't always about winning. Sometimes they were about outlasting. Not proving you were stronger, just proving you wouldn't quit first. You did everything to stay vertical. Bent knees, shorter swings. Let your armor do more work. Your mind split into commands. Don't fall. Don't puke. Don't die. You remember blinking, not seeing anything. Hearing the crowd but not processing words. Just a blur of sound. And then he fell. Not dramatically. No shout. No final swing. Just a buckle of the knees and a slow, embarrassing slide into the mud. You almost fell with him, out of sympathy, maybe, or gravity. But you stood. Barely. And in the stillness after, you realized you hadn't beaten him with power or strategy. You'd just hurt longer. You've been here before, but this moment is always new. Your opponent is on the ground, groaning, dazed. You tower above him, weapon in hand. The fight is over. Or is it? Because now comes the part where the duel's outcome gets murky. He's not dead, but he's not really fighting anymore either. His hands twitch, his eyes flicker. He might be about to yield, or he might be gathering strength for a last desperate strike. So you stand there, blade hovering, frozen between mercy and finality. Welcome to the greyest part of a medieval duel, the killing blow. Let's rewind a bit. Most people today assume a duel ends when one man dies, nice and simple. Not quite. The truth is, different kinds of duels had very different endings, and they weren't always clean. You're now in a kind of limbo that duelists dreaded. You've won, technically, but if you land one more strike, especially a fatal one, you might cross a line. Legal? Yes, in many places. Wise? Not always. It depended on who was watching. In a judicial duel, like yours, ending the fight with a death blow was expected only if the loser refused to yield. If he confessed or surrendered, killing him anyway could turn public favor, and even the law, against you. Some towns enforced this with brutal consistency. Others, well, historians still argue how strictly those lines were drawn. One case from 1411 describes a knight who decapitated a man who had dropped his weapon and knelt in surrender. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but outrage. The killer was later exiled, not for murder, but for dishonoring the ritual. Too far, they said, even for justice. Another case? A man feigned surrender, then stabbed his opponent in the throat as he leaned in to help. That one ended with both dead. Justice, via mutual disaster. So now, in this moment, with your blade raised and your enemy motionless, you have to read every signal. Is he faking it, waiting to bait you into dropping your guard? You give a warning, just one word, enough to say, "I could end this." He doesn't answer. He breathes. You step back. Because that's the other option. Let it end here. No finishing strike, no blood coup, just let him fall. Let the herald declare it. Let God have the final say. And honestly, a part of you is just too tired to lift the blade again. But it's not always this clean. In less regulated duels, those held outside court authority or between private rivals, the rules got slippery. Honor demanded an outcome, but didn't always agree on how that outcome should look. Some men walked away after disarming their opponent. Others insisted on drawing blood, even from a kneeling foe. Some just stood there, demanding a public confession. That's where things got especially ugly. In a few rare duels, the loser refused to admit defeat, even after being beaten unconscious. The victor, bound by the ritual, didn't know what to do. Kill a helpless man, or risk the whole thing being ruled inconclusive. Both outcomes carried risk. You glance around now, hoping someone will step in. And there he is, the herald. He approaches slowly, his staff raised. The crowd quiets. Even the priest stands. This is the moment, the one that decides how this story will be told. The herald kneels beside your opponent, checking his breath, waiting for him to speak. A groan. Then, barely audible, he murmurs something. You can't hear the words, but the herald does. He nods, then stands, turns to the audience and proclaims. The accused yields. The duel is ended. There's a pause, a strange, heavy stillness, and then the cheers roll in. Half relief, half approval, half people just happy they won their bets. You let your weapon fall from your hands. It hits the dirt with a solid thud, and for a second it looks like you might fall with it. But you stay upright, somehow. Here's a lesser-known fact. In some traditions, the killing blow was forbidden entirely in court-sanctioned duels. The defeated party could be judged by the result, not the death. Lose the fight, lose the case. Live to sulk about it. But in other places, killing wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Germany, 15th century, some trial duels required the loser to be executed, even after surrender. The duel merely served to identify the guilty man. What happened next was punishment. not combat. In France, things were more symbolic. Many duelists lived. Their loss was shame enough. Of course, surviving didn't mean freedom. You could still be stripped of lands, titles, even limbs. One fringe story tells of a man who won a duel, only for the judge to rule that his weapon was illegal. They reversed the verdict, executed him instead. So yeah, rules were flexible, especially when politics got involved. Back to you now. You step away as the seconds and assistants rush in to lift your opponent. He won't die today, but he won't walk clean either. That wrist might never hold a sword again. You stare down at your hands, bloodied, swollen, still shaking. You know it could have been reversed. One slip, one breath slower, one less inch of reach. That's the most terrifying part of this whole thing. You didn't win because you're the better man. You won because you're the man still standing. And maybe that's enough. You've been stitched up now, bathed, barely, wrapped in linens that smell like boiled herbs and guilt. You're resting against a wooden post near the edge of the field, watching workers rake the dirt where your opponent bled. He's gone, carted away by two red-faced squires who avoided your eyes. You'd feel worse for him if you could feel anything at all. But your body's still buzzing. Your ribs ache with each breath. The bruises are blooming like storm clouds. And in your gut, deeper than pain, sits the unsettling truth. This wasn't just a fight. It was a courtroom. Because whether anyone said it outright or not, you just participated in one of medieval Europe's strangest, deadliest legal processes, trial by combat. You didn't fight over spilled ale or a stolen horse. You fought because someone accused you, formally, in public, of something serious. Lying, theft, adultery, or worse. And in the absence of hard evidence, the court let you prove your innocence by doing the least logical thing imaginable. Trying to kill each other. Yes, that was a real legal method, and for centuries it was terrifyingly common. We're not talking duels of honor here, not private grudge matches between hot-blooded nobles. We're talking state-sanctioned justice, a legitimate replacement for a fair trial in a world with no forensic evidence, no reliable witnesses, and a deep-seated belief that God would not let the righteous man fall. It started early. We're talking 9th century Franks here, where feudal courts often had no way to settle disputes between nobles who both had land, power, and equally loud friends. Enter the judicial duel. The logic was simple. Let them fight. Let God show who's right. And the rules? Surprisingly well documented. You couldn't just swing at someone and call it justice. You had to formally accuse, submit a challenge. The other person had to accept. A date and field was selected, weapons agreed upon, witnesses summoned, oaths sworn. You remember swearing yours, your palm pressed to the hilt of your blade, words thick on your tongue. You declared, in front of nobles and commoners alike, that your claim was true, that your soul was clean, that if you died, it would be God's will. A few years ago, a man named Geoffroy accused his neighbour of poisoning his well. No one could prove it. They fought a judicial duel in full armour. Geoffroy won, barely. The court found the neighbour guilty, confiscated his land, and executed him. So yes, the stakes were high. Historians still argue whether courts genuinely believed God intervened, or if the whole system was a socially acceptable excuse to settle messy cases without looking indecisive. Either way, people lined up for it. And not just peasants. Kings endorsed it, dukes ordered it, monks recorded it. In England, trial by combat was formalised in Norman law after 1066. It was an alternative to trial by ordeal, where people walked on hot irons or plunged arms into boiling water to prove innocence. Compared to that, a sword fight almost felt reasonable. The famous English case of Wulfstan versus Walter in 1194, two men fought over land rights. Wulfstan won when he bashed Walter's head in with a club. The land became his. No appeals, no further evidence required. But here's the catch. Some people abuse the system. Imagine this. You accuse someone of a crime they didn't commit, knowing they're old, sick, or inexperienced. They have to accept your challenge or admit guilt. Either way, you win. That's why some duels ended in scandal. One noble challenged a crippled veteran for alleged slander. The court approved it. The duel was a disaster. The crowd turned on the winner. He lost face, then lost his estate to political backlash. Turns out, winning didn't always mean you were right. And sometimes, the duel never happened. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some trial-by-combat cases were solved at the last second. Either one party fled. You stare at the field now. The sun is higher, the shadows shorter. A few men are packing away the ropes, untying the shields from the posts that marked the combat zone. That was your courtroom, right there in the mud. No judge's bench, no powdered wigs, just armor, pain, and belief. You think about what would have happened if you'd lost. You could have died, of course. Or worse, been declared a liar. Dishonored, your name blackened, your property seized, your family humiliated. In some regions, a defeated duelist, even if he survived, was branded, literally, with hot iron. Because losing a trial by combat didn't just mean you lost the fight. It meant God judged you guilty. And that stayed with you. There were exceptions. In a few cases, if the defeated party could prove the fight was unfair, say the other side cheated or bribed the herald, the court might reverse its ruling. But good luck proving that after you've been trampled. A funny detail? Some judicial duels allowed champions to fight in your place. If you were too old, too young, or just not into dying that day, you could hire someone to duel for you. If they won, you walked free. If they lost, well, you probably moved towns. You didn't use a champion. You fought your own fight. You didn't win because of God, probably. You won because you trained, because you endured, because your opponent slipped first. But officially, everyone watching believes justice was done, and maybe that's what matters. You glance at your hand, still bruised, still trembling. Then you look at the dirt, and you wonder how many other truths have been buried in fields just like this one. You're sitting now under the shade of an old tree, boots off, tunic untied, letting the bruises breathe. The duel is over, but the buzz of it still clings to your skin like sweat. You shift slightly, wincing at a particularly nasty welt on your thigh. Across from you, an older knight leans against a barrel, peeling an apple with a dagger far too sharp for fruit. He chuckles. "You ever seen a woman fight a duel?" he asks, eyes twinkling. You blink. A woman? In a duel? You shake your head. He grins. "Oh, you're in for a story." And he's not joking, because while most medieval duels were between men, there were rare but wild exceptions, ones where the court allowed a man and a woman to fight each other. And the setup? Completely unhinged. Let's start with the basic problem, strength differences. Medieval society, for all its flaws, knew that throwing an armoured man against an unarmoured woman wasn't exactly a fair match. So what did they do? They tried to level the field, in the strangest ways possible. In some German and Central European tradition, especially during the 13th and 14th centuries, when a woman challenged a man, or vice versa, the court set gender clause rules. Equalizers, modifiers. Let's just say balance took a very creative form. Picture this. A duel between husband and wife. The husband stands waist-deep in a pit, with one arm tied behind his back. The woman? She's on solid ground, armed with a club or rock wrapped in a cloth, and she's free to move. It sounds made up, but records confirm it happened. Historians still argue whether these matches were common law, folk custom, or just isolated regional practices. Some believe they were exaggerated in later writings, but enough surviving legal texts and illustrations back them up. including one unforgettable image, a man in a hole, red-faced and humiliated, swinging wildly at a woman who looks like she's done this before. And these duels weren't just for fun. They settled real charges: adultery, slander, theft, even domestic abuse. If a woman accused her husband of violence and he denied it, the court might order a duel to decide the truth. You look at the knight, who's still grinning. "Bedtime," he says. Saw a baker's wife knock out her husband with a single swing. Crowd went mad. The priest fainted. He's probably exaggerating, but maybe not. Let's be clear, these weren't gladiatorial bloodbaths. More often they were symbolic, highly regulated, and usually stopped when one side was clearly defeated or surrendered. But the fact that they existed at all says something about... It wasn't just husbands and wives either. In rare cases, unrelated men and women fought over land disputes or business deals. One record mentions a woman named Anna in Bavaria who challenged a man over forged documents. She fought him, and won. The woman's weapon varied by region. In some traditions, it was a sack filled with sand or rocks. In others, it was a staff. The idea was simple: compensate for brute strength by limiting the man's mobility or weapon choice. Sometimes both fighters were given equal weapons but different armor. One 15th century document suggests a duel where both parties fought with daggers, but the man wore light mail while the woman wore a thick leather smock. Practical? Not really. But again, symbolism mattered. Quirky detail? In one account, a woman was allowed to wear a padded hood soaked in vinegar, supposedly to cool her head and prevent panic. Whether that was science or superstition, no one knows. Probably neither. You're starting to wonder how many of these duels turned into actual wins for the women, and surprisingly, more than you'd expect. In most recorded outcomes where women fought, they didn't just survive, they won. Maybe not often, but often enough that the crowd started taking them seriously. One noblewoman, Agnes Huttart, famously donned armor and beat a knight in disguise, revealing herself only after the victory. Legend says her father was sick, so she took his place. The court accepted it. The knight sulked for years. Of course, stories like that were rare and controversial. Which brings us to another layer of this: shame. A man losing to a woman in public, in front of nobles, clergy, maybe even his own servants. That was social death. He might never show his face again. Sometimes his punishment extended beyond the duel: fines, banishment, even shaving his head as a mark of disgrace. Women, too, took huge risks. If they lost, especially in a case involving accusations against their husbands or male relatives, they could be executed. Trial by combat meant accepting the consequences, win or lose. Gender didn't shield you. And still some stepped up, stood on the field, fought. You glance down at your own bruises. Think of that fight, the fatigue, the terror. Now imagine doing it in skirts, with society betting against you. Yeah, respect. The knight beside you stands, stretches, and tosses his apple core into the dirt. Next time someone says women didn't fight, he says, remind him we just stopped writing about it. You nod, then pause. One last thought hits you. All of this, the pit duels, the sacks of rocks, the bent rules, none of it was fair, but none of it was entirely foolish either. It was medieval justice, as messy and improvised as the times demanded. And somewhere out there, centuries ago, a woman stood above a pit, club in hand, while the crowd leaned in to watch a very different kind of truth swing down. You wake the next morning still aching, still sore, but alive. That counts for something. The bruises haven't faded. Your ribs still throb when you laugh or breathe. The squire tries to hand you a bowl of thin stew, and your hand trembles as you reach for it. You feel like you were trampled by a wagon, then chased by it again just for fun. You'd think, after everything, people would want to stop dueling. You'd think wrong, because for every duel like yours, painful, raw, humiliating, There were dozens more happening across Europe, some even bloodier. And while a few brave souls did try to ban the whole business, dueling was like mold on bread. Hard to kill, always finding its way back. Let's talk about the killjoys. Kings, popes, priests, bureaucrats. They all tried, in their own way, to get rid of dueling, especially the kind that spilled out of the courtroom and into alleyways, courtyards, or castle grounds after too much wine. The church was the first major voice against it. As early as the 9th century, popes condemned trial by combat as barbaric and ungrounded. The idea that God would take sides in a fistfight? That didn't sit well with men preaching mercy and forgiveness. By the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council outright banned clergy from being involved in or witnessing judicial duels. Priests were forbidden to bless combatants. Church courts refused to recognize duel verdicts. Trial by fire? Still weirdly acceptable. Trial by sword? Too pagan. And yet, it kept happening. Kings too tried to shut it down. In France, King Louis IX, Saint Louis, banned judicial duels in the mid-1200s. He replaced them with more structured inquests and legal reforms. He believed justice should come from logic and investigation, not bashing someone's skull in. Historians still argue how effective his reforms really were. In practice, duels kept occurring under the radar. Nobles who didn't trust the courts, or who didn't like what the courts decided, turned to private combat to set things right. Because dueling, like gossip, has always thrived in the gaps between law and ego. England followed suit. Kind of. By the 14th century, English common law courts leaned away from combat. Judges preferred juries. But the right to trial by combat was never formally abolished. It remained a dormant option for centuries, like a bear trap left open in the woods. Quirky fact. The last formal request for trial by combat in England was in 1818. Yes, the 19th century. A man named Abraham Thornton, accused of murder, invoked his ancient right. The court, surprisingly, accepted it. His accuser backed down. Thornton walked free. 1 step forward, 2 centuries back. But even as legal combat declined, another kind of duel started to take over. Personal duels of honor. No judges, no courts, just insults, pride, and the promise of violence. These were the fights where men said, "You slandered me," and then proved it by stabbing each other behind the stables. Rulers hated these too. In the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Maximilian I issued decrees forbidding private duels. In England, Queen Elizabeth the Conscient condemned them as a threat to national unity. In France, King Henry the Author outlawed dueling and punished violators harshly. Did it work? Let's just say Henry IV outlawed dueling in 1599, and by 1610 he was assassinated by a former duelist. So no. The bans rarely stuck because dueling wasn't just about law, it was about reputation, honor, status, especially among nobles, who often cared more about how they were perceived than what they actually owned. One noble might say to another, "You dishonored my name." The other might reply, "You smell like goat dung," and boom, duel. Laws couldn't reach that deep. They couldn't touch that raw nerve. So people kept fighting, despite fines, prison, even execution. In some cases, kings turned a blind eye, especially if the duel served political purposes. Need a messy land dispute cleared? Let the cousins duel. Need a loud knight silenced? Encourage a duel and bet against him. You shift now, adjusting your bandages, wondering how many people watched your fight with political hopes. Maybe someone in the crowd wanted you to lose. Maybe they placed coin on your fall. Maybe they were hoping for a ban after seeing how brutal it got. Because that's another angle. Duels that ended so badly they triggered new laws. In 1386, a high-profile judicial duel in France ended with one man mutilated and the other celebrated. The carnage shocked enough people that courts in Paris started scaling back on legal combat altogether. But banning duels was like trying to ban heartbreak. It keeps coming back. You hear horses clattering past the window now. A group of squires, armoured, laughing, carrying weapons far too sharp for breakfast. Probably off to watch Botters fight, another duel in the next village. The ritual never sleeps. And even as authorities clamped down harder, people just got creative. Some nobles held practice duels that were basically real fights under fake rules. Others met in foreign lands where the laws were looser. Some staged accidental encounters in roads or meadows, conveniently away from judges. You rub your temples, exhausted. And here's the real kicker. The harder rulers tried to kill dueling, the more romanticized it became. Poets wrote of brave champions, artists painted heroic last stands. Even the church, at times, quietly admired the courage it took to risk death for truth. That's the problem with banning something people admire. It doesn't make them stop. It just makes them hide it better. You exhale, stare at the ceiling, and whisper something only half serious. Good luck outlawing that. You're back on your feet now, barely, wrapped tight in linen, ribs cinched like barrels, walking with the stiff, jerky rhythm of someone who just got hit by a siege tower. The healer tells you to rest. But there's a man in the courtyard retelling your duel like it's a tavern epic. He's got the crowd leaning in. You hear him embellish the part where you allegedly disarmed your opponent with a whirlwind pirouette. You didn't. You slipped on mud and landed a lucky elbow. But you let him talk. Because that's how duels live on. Stories. And some duels, they don't just get remembered. They change everything. One wrong step, one fatal blow, and history pivots. So tonight, still sore and quiet, you listen to a few of the duels that became more than combat. They became consequences. Let's start with one you know. Jean de Carouge, Vergy-Chac-le-Gris. December 29, 1386, Paris. Probably the most famous judicial duel of the Middle Ages. De Carouge accused Legris of raping his wife, Marguerite. No witnesses. No confessions. The court couldn't decide. So King Charles VI approved a trial by combat. It was brutal. Lances, swords, daggers, fists. In front of royalty, nobility, and thousands of citizens, they fought until Legris lay dead in the dirt. De Carouge lived. His wife was vindicated. The case became a legend. Paintings were made, books written, movies filmed. But what really mattered? The duel reshaped how rape cases were handled in France. Marguerite had spoken out, and her husband fought for her. It put pressure on the courts. It proved public opinion had weight. And it terrified the nobility. Because it showed how quickly honour could become spectacle. Another example? The Duel of the Mignons, April 27, 1578. France again, but this time not over justice, over fashion and influence. 5 noblemen fought, 3 for the Duke of Guise, 2 for King Henri III. It was supposed to be private. Instead it became an open-air bloodbath in Paris. All 5 were wounded, 3 died, including the king's favourite. The duel shocked the country. Why? Because it wasn't political. It was petty, triggered by insults and pride. But it symbolized the growing chaos in Henry's court and the dangerous grip courtiers had over national decisions. The king wept. The people mocked him. And suddenly, dueling was no longer just a nobleman's sport. It was a national embarrassment. After that, Henry tried to ban duels again. Spoiler, it didn't stick. You sit on the edge of a well now, the courtyard emptying. A local bard strums a tune nearby, something mournful, likely based on a duel no one remembers accurately. They rarely do. But let's visit another fight. Sir James Stewart versus George Wharton, 1609, Scotland. They duelled over nothing. A misplaced word, a sideways glance. Stewart won. Wharton died. The king, furious, because Stuart was his cousin. The duel sparked a crackdown across the British Isles, especially among nobles. King James I issued decree after decree trying to suppress private fights. One of them became law. The others became inspiration. Why? Because the duel had become romantic, a symbol of passion, of refusing to be ignored. And that's why even punishments couldn't stop the tide. Some duels were quieter, but no less powerful. The Hamilton-Mohun duel in 1712, technically outside the medieval era but still relevant, took place in Hyde Park, London. Both men died. The public was outraged. Queen Anne used the moment to pass the Act for the Prevention of Dueling, which criminalised seconds as well as fighters. Did it work? Not really. But it showed one thing. When duels went public, laws followed. Fringe fact. There was a 13th century duel in Germany between two minor barons. One was stabbed in the thigh. Infection set in. He died. But the land dispute tied to his name triggered 3 decades of war between their families. Thousands dead, all from one jab to the leg. Historians still debate whether the duel caused the war or was just the spark on a dry pile of grievances. Either way, the stab started it. So yes, duels had impact. Not always immediate, not always direct, but ripple effects? Absolutely. You look up now, watching clouds drift by. Somewhere, someone is already retelling your fight. They'll remember how you stood, how you swung, how your opponent yielded. They won't remember how scared you were, or how you almost passed out, or how you still don't know if you were right. They'll remember the outcome. That's the power of these fights. They make myths, and myths make movements. Your duel might not change a kingdom, or start a rebellion, or shift legal codes. But it changed you. And somewhere, someday, it might just change someone else too. Because duels don't end when the sword drops. They echo. You limp through the village square with a fresh bandage around your knee, a crutch under one arm, and a burning question in your head. How did some duelists manage to screw up this badly? Because for every fight that becomes legend, dozens crash and burn in pure, ridiculous failure. Welcome to the lesser-known side of medieval dueling, the cheaters, the cowards, the fakers, the flinchers, and the downright incompetent. And believe it or not, people loved these stories. Let's start with a classic. The Runner. A duelist so overcome with panic at the last moment that he actually turns and bolts from the field. Not a strategic withdrawal, a full sprint. One 14th century record from Burgundy tells of a squire who challenged a merchant to trial by combat. When the weapons were drawn, the squire threw down his shield and leapt into the nearby stream, never to be seen again. The merchant won by default, and the squire's name became a local insult. You chuckle, because even now it's hard not to imagine the scene. Banners flying, a serious crowd, the herald about to speak, and one of the fighters just nopes into... Fleeing a duel often meant immediate guilt. In judicial combats, that was as good as a confession. Your lands could be seized. You might be branded. In some regions, they hanged you anyway for wasting everyone's time. Then there were the fainters. Yes, duelists who passed out before the first blow, sometimes from fear, sometimes from fasting too long before the fight, sometimes because their armour was too tight. One account from Swabia says a knight collapsed mid-oath and cracked his helmet on the post. He was disqualified for spiritual unfitness. Historians still argue whether some of these were genuine or just tactical feints, an attempt to dodge a death sentence by claiming divine weakness. Did it work? Occasionally, especially if you were rich and the crowd was feeling generous. And then, of course, came the cheats. There were many ways to cheat in a medieval duel. Let's count the most absurd. 1. Hidden weapons. Some duelists snuck in an extra dagger beneath their tunic. One knight in 1392 attached a spike to the inside of his gauntlet. When he went in for a hand fake, he stabbed his opponent. The herald cried foul. The crowd cried murder. The knight cried mercy, then lost his title and was exiled. 2. Tampered armor. Stuffing extra padding into mail. Reinforcing a helmet with hidden rivets. Lining a gambeson with wood or metal beyond what was agreed. These tricks weren't just shady, they were a legal offence. Armour inspectors were sometimes appointed to prevent this. Didn't always work. 3. Poison. Oh yes, rare, but it happened. Smearing poison on a blade or spike. The problem? If caught, you weren't just guilty, you were sentenced for sacrilege. One Frenchman in 1310 used a poisoned knife during a night duel. He won, then died 2 days later from exposure to his own weapon. Poetic justice, medieval style. You pause near the baker's stool and lean on your crutch. The baker hands you a hunk of bread, muttering something about how glad he is you didn't embarrass the town. You nod. But you know how close it came, because even decent fighters have bad days. There's the famous tale of Sir Gawain, who challenged a man over stolen pigs. The crowd gathered. Gawain tripped walking onto the field. His helmet rolled off. His opponent, seizing the moment, bonked him on the head before the herald even said, "Begin." The judges ruled it a legitimate blow. Gervais woke up 3 hours later. The pig stage stolen. And it's not just men. One woman in a mixed-gender duel, remember those, tripped on her hem trying to circle the pit. She hit her own foot with the sack of rocks and dislocated her ankle. Her opponent, stuck waist-deep in a hole, hadn't even swung yet. The duel was paused. The priest called it divine intervention. Her ankle disagreed. Let's not forget the forgery for honor types. These were the duelists who faked challenges just to seem brave. They'd send a formal declaration, spread the word, then vanish before the fight. Or worse, show up, act surprised, and claim their enemy never responded. It worked, until the accused pulled out the original letter. One noble did this so often he earned the nickname Lord Hollowglove. He was eventually challenged by 5 men at once. He didn't show. The king stripped his lands and gave his estate to the best storyteller in the group. A rare win for narrative justice. Then there were the duels that just fizzled. One record from the Low Countries describes 2 men so evenly matched and so equally terrified that after circling for an hour they both dropped their weapons and declared the other a gentleman of remarkable courage. The crowd booed. The priests approved. The judges fined them for wasting everyone's morning. Quirky detail: some duels failed before they even began thanks to weather. Heavy rain meant the ground turned to soup. Helmlets rusted. Horses panicked. There are 3 confirmed cases of lightning strikes hitting the field mid-duel. In each one, the combatants dropped their weapons and ran. Historians call these acts of God. Most call it divine sarcasm. You pass the tailor's window and catch your reflection, bandaged, scuffed, still alive. You didn't cheat, you didn't faint, you didn't flee. But you know the line between victory and disaster is thinner than thread. Because for every celebrated duelist, there are 10 whose names became punchlines. You made it through. Barely. And for now, that's more than most. You're sitting by the fire now, watching the embers fade into soft orange. The tavern's gone quiet. A few old men play dice near the door. The girl behind the counter hums while sweeping. Your breath still hurts when you laugh, but not as much as it did yesterday. Someone asks, "Ever walk away from a duel that never happened?" You nod slowly. Because sometimes the most haunting duels aren't the ones you fought. They're the ones you didn't. There's a special breed of tension in preparing for a fight that never comes. The build-up, the dread, the long nights spent rehearsing death in your head, and then nothing. No blade, no signal, just silence. That's the duel that never was. You remember yours like a ghost. A nobleman, angry, loud, red-cheeked, challenged you over something that doesn't even matter now. A rumor, maybe. A misheard word. You accepted. You chose the weapon. You practiced until your knuckles bled. And then, 2 days before the duel, he vanished. Some say he rode out of town. Some say his uncle paid off the heralds. One man claimed he took ill from fear. Another claimed he was poisoned by his own brother to prevent disgrace. Whatever the truth, he never showed. You didn't celebrate. You didn't brag. Because you didn't win. But you felt the whole thing. Every muscle, every second, every dream of losing. And that weight, it stays with you longer than bruises. In the medieval world, duels that never happened were almost as significant as those that did, because intentions had weight. A challenge was a public declaration of truth, or at least of confidence, and if one party failed to show up, that was guilt. Usually. Sometimes it was fear, sometimes strategy, sometimes pure luck. Historians still argue whether most cancelled duels were political backpedals or personal breakdowns. The truth? Often both. Power is messy. A classic example, the almost duel between William Marshal and Guy of Lusignan, two political heavyweights in the 12th century. Tensions rose, insults flew. Seconds were chosen. The king intervened hours before they met with swords. Peace was preserved, but the story lingered, and so did the pride wounds. Sometimes the duel never happened because cooler heads prevailed. Mediators stepped in. Priests offered alternatives. Gold changed hands. Apologies were brokered. A man would rather kneel in court than die on the field. Or worse, his mother intervened. You think that's a joke? Think again. There are at least 4 recorded cases where noblewomen interrupted duels by throwing themselves between the fighters, or begging kings to outlaw the fight before it happened. In 2 of those cases, the women were mothers of the combatants. One even smuggled her son out of town in the middle of the night and left a note for his opponent. "My boy is a fool. He'll thank me later." He didn't, but he lived. And then there's the fake duel, the staged event meant to show bravery without actually risking life. 2 men exchange written challenges. They dress, mount, ride out, and never swing. Maybe they both secretly agreed to call it a draw. Maybe the crowd stopped them. Maybe a nearby bar distracted them. Either way, they return heroes. Scarless, clean, smiling. Cowards? Maybe. Smart? Probably. Here's a fringe case for you. In 1364, 2 merchants from Bruges planned a duel over trade rights. Before the fight, they met in private, flipped a coin, and declared whoever lost would pretend to faint in the ring. One did, the other won. The crowd cheered, business carried on. Years later, the truth came out during a drunken confession. Both men were fined. You shift on your bench, thinking of all the time you spent preparing for duels that never came. How many hours wasted training, checking weapons, praying, writing farewells, all for nothing. But is it really nothing? Because here's the secret, even cancelled duels have consequences. They change reputations, they shift alliances. Sometimes, the threat of a duel is enough to settle a dispute, or inflame it. Your almost duel? It got people talking. Some thought you were lucky, others called your opponent a coward. Either way, your name travelled farther than it would have from a quiet victory. And that's the power. Not fighting can still define you. It can haunt you too. One knight, known only as Alaric, prepared for a duel against a rival who never appeared. Alaric showed up, armoured, ready. His enemy sent a letter. "I choose not to stain my sword on your lies." The crowd turned on Alaric. No blood was shed. But his honour bled out for years. He died in a different province, still explaining the duel that never happened. Not all walkaways are victories. But neither are they shameful. Sometimes, survival is the win. You stand now, slowly, feeling the strain in your spine and knees. The fire's burned down, the bards asleep, the dice game's ended. And for a second you imagine what your life would look like if all your fights had happened. If every insult had led to blood. If every threat had been answered with steel. There'd be less of you left. So here's to the duels that didn't happen. The ones interrupted by weather, wisdom, bribery, or mercy. The ones that changed nothing, but somehow changed everything. You wake to birdsong and the sound of two young men arguing over the length of a lance. One's clearly never held one before, the other's pretending he's a knight. Their voices echo through the practice yard like they're preparing for a duel of their own. You sit up slowly, ribs still stitched tight, and peer through the wooden slats in the window. What you see down there doesn't look like a duel. It looks like a show. Silk banners, polished armor, even music. And just like that, you realize something. The age of the brutal, muddy, unfiltered duel you fought in is starting to fade. Welcome to the late medieval period, where dueling starts getting fancy. You watch as the boys try to mimic stances they've clearly never learned. One swings a staff in a wide arc that would have gotten him gutted in a real fight. The other poses like a statue. You chuckle, but you also get it. This isn't just about combat anymore. It's about performance. By the 15th century, dueling had begun to shift from a deadly necessity to something stylized, almost ceremonial. Blades still cut, bones still broke, but now there were rules, scoring, even applause. We're entering the world of tournaments, part, d'armes, and chivalric codes. Dueling wasn't disappearing, it was being refined. Here's the difference. Early duels were about justice, or rage. You fought because someone challenged your truth. Someone threatened your name, your family, your soul. But now, you fight for honor, yes, but also fashion, reputation, courtly admiration, and sometimes because it looks good. One of the biggest changes? Formal codes of conduct. Combat masters like Hans Talhofer, Fiore de Liberi, and Johannes Lichtenauer started writing detailed manuals, known as Fechtbuchs. These were the martial arts textbooks of their time, filled with illustrations, footwork diagrams, and step-by-step combat sequences. Historians still argue how widespread these teachings were. Some believe they were mostly for the elite. Others say they filtered down to soldiers and civilians alike. Either way, they became the foundation for a new kind of dueling. Structured, codified, almost academic. You yourself remember seeing a Fechtmeister in a nearby town. He wore fine gloves, had a wooden sword with notches in it, and lectured students about balance and breath. He also carried a stick to smack their ankles when they got sloppy. He never fought a real duel in his life, but his students walked taller. And then there's the rise of tournaments, the medieval equivalent of a sporting event. These weren't always the multi-day jousting festivals we imagine. Some were private. Some were challenge duels fought in front of nobles with carefully selected rules. 3 passes, 5 strikes, first blood wins. Armor was polished, weapons dulled, banners embroidered. And if you died, well, at least it was elegant. A particularly strange invention of this era was the pas d'armes, where a knight would set up a dueling checkpoint, often on a bridge or mountain pass, and challenge anyone who wanted to cross. It was less highway robbery, more glorified theatre. One noble even created a dueling garden and invited foreign knights to challenge him amid flower beds and fountains. Losers had to leave behind a token of shame. Winners got roses and a kiss from the host's sister. Probably. There's a fringe story of a knight named Raymond of Toulouse, who held a pas d'armes for 7 days straight. He fought 18 challengers, won 15, and then married his horse in a drunken ceremony on the final night. No one knows if that part's true, but the horse had a saddle with pearls on it, so maybe he had a point. And here's another change. Weapons got weirdly beautiful. Swords engraved with prayers, daggers inlaid with gold, even blunt training weapons with ornate carvings. Duels were becoming as much about spectacle as skill. Some carried swords not to kill, but to impress. A dueling blade became a status symbol, a declaration of class and taste. You once saw a knight draw a sword with peacock feathers on the hilt. He lost the duel, of course. Feathers don't parry well. This whole shift also birthed a new kind of duelist, the bravo. Not quite a knight, not quite a thug. Dressed sharp, thought sharper. These men were half warriors, half performers, strutting into courts, issuing poetic challenges, carving their names into doorposts. They didn't fight for survival, they fought for attention. Attention became a kind of armor. But don't be fooled. Duels could still be deadly. They just looked prettier on the surface. The biggest change? People started keeping score. Some tournaments awarded points based on number of hits, grace of movement, even style. Losing didn't mean death, it meant embarrassment. A lost duel now meant fewer invitations, fewer glances from noble ladies, maybe a mocking poem. One poet wrote of a knight who lost 3 duels in a week and rhymed his name with craven turnip. The poem outlived the knight by decades. You shift in your chair now, watching as the 2 boys finally give up and sit in the grass, panting. They laugh. No bruises, no blood, no gods watching from the sky. Just the dream of glory, and maybe a girl watching from a window. You can't blame them. There's something appealing about the elegance of it all. The ritual, the polish, the idea that duels could be beautiful, not just brutal. But deep down you know the truth. Whether it's a field of mud or a garden of roses, a duel is still a duel. All the silk and song in the world won't matter. You're in the smithy now, sitting on a bench warmed by the forge. The blacksmith's hammer clinks rhythmically as he reshapes your dented gauntlet. The steel is bruised like your ribs. He says nothing, just works, wiping sweat with a sleeve thicker than your armor. You watch him, tired eyes blinking in the smoke, and think, this shouldn't still be happening. As outside the world is changing. Gunpowder is here. Cannons tear through castle walls like paper. Pistols are popping up in noble hands. The battlefield is evolving fast, and yet men still meet in fields with blades and rules to settle grudges the old-fashioned way. These are the last duels of Europe, and they are as stubborn as they are strange. Let's rewind. The 1500s. The Renaissance is blooming. Cities are buzzing. People are writing about science, love, anatomy, planets. But some of those same people are also strapping on swords and walking into duels because someone said their uncle raised pigs poorly. The irony, many late medieval duels weren't legally necessary anymore. Courts were improving. Judges had more evidence, witnesses, options. But people still duelled. Why? Because honor didn't evolve as fast as society. And that's the secret. You can invent gunpowder, you can build libraries, you can discover that the earth spins, but if someone insults your lineage in front of a crowd, the fastest way to recover your dignity is still a blade in the morning. Take Italy, for instance. By the 16th century, cities like Florence and Milan had thriving dueling cultures. Fencing schools popped up everywhere. Masters published manuals not for survival, but for flourish. How to duel with poise, how to parry with style, how to kill. They taught dagger work, cloak tactics, rapier passes, all designed for quick, elegant, deadly encounters. If medieval dueling was brawling, Renaissance dueling was chess, with knives. In Spain, the Code of Honra ruled the noble class. Say the wrong thing, stare too long at someone's sister, write a poem with the wrong implication, duel. Not in the woods, in the courtyard, with gloves, seconds, and maybe a priest watching discreetly from behind a pillar. France, no better. Despite multiple royal edicts banning duels, including one by King Henry IV, who declared that the loss of one subject is the weakening of the crown. French nobles kept fighting anyway. One count, when warned by the king not to duel, replied, "Then your majesty must duel me first, for you insult my courage." He duelled. He died. Historians still debate what drove these men: honor, addiction to violence, vanity. But there's a simpler explanation. Status was fragile. Reputation was everything. One stain on your name could cost you land, marriage, position. So when someone slighted you, you responded not with words, but with wounds. The blacksmith turns to you now, holding up the gauntlet. It's whole again, better than before. You thank him, but he just shrugs. "I've fixed 3 today," he mutters. "Might fix 4 before sunset." Even the craftsmen know it's not over yet. And don't think it was just nobles still dueling. Commoners got in on the action too. Especially in Germany, where the Fechschulen, fighting schools, became community events. People paid to watch local men duel with swords, clubs, or staves. Points were awarded. Winners got silver. Losers got bruised egos and sometimes actual funerals. One fringe case: a miller in Augsburg challenged his rival over flour prices. They fought with flails in front of the town guild. The miller lost a tooth. His rival gained customers. Justice, apparently. But back to the nobles. The most infamous late medieval duel might be the Jarnac duel of 1547. Guy Chabot de Jarnac was mocked for supposedly being unfaithful to his wife. He challenged François de Vivonne to clear his name. Everyone expected Jarnac to lose. Instead, he trained in secret, used a new move, a clever strike to the back of the knee, and won. The duel became legendary. Fencing masters copied the technique. Coup de Jarnac entered the French language, and people started whispering about secret duel science, a hint that technique could defeat strength. That duel marked a shift. From raw power to precision. From brute force to brilliance. You adjust your tunic now, thinking of all the final duels, the ones fought as Europe tilted toward modernity. Duels over paintings. Duels over spilled wine. Duels where one man used a sword and the other brought a gun. Yes, that started happening. The sword-to-pistol transition wasn't overnight, but by the late 1500s, wheel-lock pistols and matchlocks began appearing in duels, first as backups, then as primaries. And people still died, just faster. One account tells of a duel where both men fired, missed, then calmly drew rapiers and continued. Another ended with one man killed by a misfire before the count of 3. No chivalry and a spark of powder. And so, the old duel began to die. Not with a scream, but with a quiet, smoky pop. But it didn't vanish completely. Even as the world modernized, the idea of the duel stayed. A ritual, a rite, a last resort when all else failed. You look down at your hands now, scarred, still strong, and you wonder how many more duels you'll see before your blade is just a relic on a wall. Because it's clear, these are the last true duels. Real steel, real stakes, real silence afterward. Soon they'll be replaced by paper, courts, gossip, lawyers. But for now, men still meet at dawn, still whisper their last words, still raise their blades with shaking hands, and still try, foolishly, proudly, to settle truth with blood. You're back where it began, on the same field, now empty, dew-damp and quiet. The trampled dirt's healed, the poles are gone. No spectators, no heralds, just wind, birds, and your own thoughts. You walk the perimeter slowly, one hand trailing along the grass, retracing footsteps you don't remember taking. The bruise on your chest has darkened to a mottled green. The scar on your hand is almost beautiful now, like a badge. It hits you, standing here. Duels never really leave. You can ban them, you can bury the blades, but the urge, the human pull to make conflict physical, to prove rightness through pain, it lingers. It always has. Even now, centuries later, the duel lives on. Not always with steel, not always in the mud, but in spirit. In the way we defend our names, in the way we escalate simple slights, in the way we treat arguments like battles, where someone must fall for the other to be seen. People say we're more civilized now. Maybe. But let's not kid ourselves. The ritual just changed clothes. A court case over a tweet, a screaming match in the street, a silent war between reputations. These are duels too. No swords, but plenty of damage. Historians still argue whether duels were primitive justice or necessary outlets. Did they prevent war or provoke it? Were they heroic or idiotic? They were all of it. Duels were religion wrapped in rage, law dressed as violence. They were raw and ridiculous, holy and hopeless, and somehow deeply human. Because beneath the armour, beneath the laws and rituals and banners and oaths, there was always just one thing. A person standing in front of another person saying, "I matter, and I'm ready to bleed for it." You sit down now in the middle of the field. The sky's gone pale with the promise of rain. You should go soon, but you don't. Not yet. You think of all the duelists before you, the ones who died, the ones who lived, the ones who walked away, and the ones who never got the chance. You remember their stories, the woman with the rucksack, the man in the waist-deep pit, the knight who danced with death and won, the baker's apprentice who lost a tooth and his pride in the same hour. You remember your own. The fear, the first blow, the blur of rage, the moment it got messy, the mercy you gave, or maybe didn't. You wonder if someone's telling your story now, if a crowd somewhere is reciting your name in a tale that's already getting the details wrong. You hope they get one thing right. You stood. Not perfectly, not nobly, but honestly. And that's what makes a duel more than just violence. It's not about the weapon, it's about the moment, when pride, fear, belief, and resolve all collide in one terrifying heartbeat. The moment you decide that silence won't do, that walking away would hurt more than any blade, that you, for whatever reason, must face the field. And when that moment comes, even if the world calls it foolish, even if your knees shake and your hands tremble, you still step forward. Because even now, with courts and codes and compromise, part of you still believes something sacred happens when two people look each other in the eye and say, "Then let's settle this." You stand, brush the dirt from your knees, and walk off the field. You leave no footprints. But you know you were here, and so will history. The sky darkens now, soft and slow, like someone dimming the lights at the end of a long performance. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of moss and steel. You breathe deeper, slower. No more shouting, no more stomping feet, just the faint rustle of leaves and the low hum of wind moving through empty space. Your body aches less now, not because the pain is gone, but because it's quiet, a silence that settles inside your bones. You feel it with every blink, every breath. The field, the fight, the fury, all of it slipping behind your eyelids like a dream you're almost ready to forget. You're not thinking about armor anymore, or weapons, or glory. You're thinking of warmth, of the weightless peace that comes only after a storm. You're thinking of firelight, of soft beds, of quiet rooms where no one calls your name. You lie down in your mind, let the noise fade, let the world grow softer. Your heartbeat slows, your hands unclench. There's nothing left to prove, no one to fight, no field to defend, just sleep, waiting behind the next breath. The duel is over. And so is the night. The story ends here. Close your eyes. Drift deep. Sweet dreams.